let's start with, and I think, this audience, broadly speaking, probably understands the broad strokes of the problem when we talk about income inequality. But give us a sense of where we are in terms of income inequality and what are the hallmarks of it.
Well, essentially over the past 4 decades, we've had an enormous shift of income in the United States. The share of income that goes to the bottom 90% of Americans has been more than cut in half. And meanwhile, the share of income that goes to the top 1% has nearly tripled, from 7% at its lowest ebb in the middle of the 20th century to 21, 22%, depending on the study today. So it's an enormous change in who has income, who has wealth, and who has power in the United States.
Give us some figures when it comes to, and I don't have it in front of me, but you wrote about the income and wage income that folks in, I guess, in the first 90% of our country are capturing, and I know that we see this in the context of things like of Social Security taxes, what they capture, but give us a sense, a little more sense of what's happening in terms of just wages and income.
Okay, so essentially, since the end of the 1960s, the beginning of the 1970s, real incomes for the bottom 90% have essentially totally stagnated. There's been no increase after you take inflation into account, despite fairly substantial increases in the productivity of the U.S. economy. So the gap between the bottom 90%, since 1990 alone, the gap between the bottom 90% and the top 0.1%, that gap has more than doubled only since 1990. There's been a tremendous concentration of labor income at the top of our economic summit.
What are the factors that have driven this from your perspective?
Well, there are a number of factors, but in the middle of the 20th century, when we did become substantially more equal as an American society, there were 2 major institutional factors that drove that growing equality in the United States, and those 2 factors were closely related. One was the progressive income tax system. We had tax rates in the United States in the 20 years after World War II that hovered over 90% for the top income bracket. So that was one major factor, those progressive tax rates in those decades right after World War II. Second factor was a strong labor movement. The combination of those 2 kept incomes in the United States at the top from escalating and rose incomes at the base of the American economy.
So we had, and my understanding is that the top income bracket at that time was probably around, if I'm not mistaken from memory, somewhere around like $470,000, and probably equivalent to like $3 million today. Would that be where it was?
That's right. So individual income over $200,000 and joint return income over $400,000 was subject to that 91% tax rate throughout the Eisenhower years in the 1950s.
And then of course the labor movement was sort of adding pressure on wages at the lower end of the scale and sort of pushing it all towards the middle, and that's what gave us, at least in part, the Great Compression. So as that fell apart, like what was the nature of the of that regime falling apart? I mean, we saw. I know at one point Kennedy lowers taxes to 75%, but as far as I can tell, the big jump was that change in capital gains taxes and how CEOs and folks in that corner of the offices were paid.
That's right. The first tax cut proposal, as you said, came from John F. Kennedy in 1963. He proposed a 65% top rate instead of the 91%. Congress went along with a 70% top tax rate, and then Ronald Reagan in 1980 dropped the rate first to 50, top rate first to 50%, and then to 28%. Meanwhile, as those tax rates for the top income bracket were shrinking, we saw CEO pay rising. So in the 1960s, typical CEOs of major corporations only made 30 times more than their workers. Today, they're averaging over 300 times more than their workers. Again, there's been a tremendous shift, and those CEO pay figures are closely related to the tax figures. If you have a 91% top rate, what's the sense of paying a CEO more? Because if we pay the CEO more, that more will most of it will simply get taxed away. But as tax rates lower, then there becomes more and more incentive on the part of CEOs and corporations to raise those top pay rates.
And I mean, when we talk about raising, and I know this is a little bit outside of what you do, but when we talk about, like, there was just a decision to pay the CEO, like, what is that process? Like, I mean, because it just sounds like, oh, well, we're going to pay them more because they're going to get more, right? Like, there's no, like, who's making that decision making? Because it really is, I mean, as far as I can tell, a bunch of people sitting around at the top of the company, board of directors, saying, like, if he gets more, and I do mean if he gets more, we're all going to get more. Right? I mean,
that's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And if you look at the makeup of corporate boards, many of the people serving on corporate boards are top executives at other corporations. So it's a huge game of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and that over time, of course, escalates CEO pay at the top.
All right, and that form of CEO pay, and what form does it take? I mean, it's not like this is not. We're not going to just we're paying you wages, and we're the first 110,000 is subject to 120,000 subject to Social Security taxes. You're going to be paying FICA Medicare taxes for your entire wages when people get $15 million a year or something like that, right? It's paid. Most of it's paid through capital gains.
It's paid through stock-based compensation. So you have the basic CEO paycheck, a paycheck like regular working people receive, and that only makes up a minor proportion of the pay packages that CEOs receive. The vast majority of the pay that goes to top CEOs comes in the form of stock-based compensation. It can either be stock options, where CEOs get the option to buy stock at a low rate when that stock appreciates in value, and then can sell the stock and make a killing, or in what's called restricted stock, where CEOs will get a certain number of shares at a certain point. So at their second anniversary, third anniversary, or if they make some sort of statistical milestone, they'll get a chunk of shares of stock outright. And when you add up those stock rewards plus bonuses, they dwarf what CEOs get in actual paycheck income.
I ask you this only because I still remember getting your other 98%, I think, newsletters back in the day. But what is there data? Has anybody graphed layoffs relative to when stocks vest in CEOs? Because I'd be really curious to see the relationship between major cost cutting and how many months in advance, or how many months there's a difference between when that takes place and a CEO gets a big vesting of stocks.
Well, at the Institute for Policy Studies, in Washington, where I have my shingle, every Labor Day since 1993, we've released an annual report that looks at CEO compensation, and each of these reports usually has a particular theme. So we've looked, for instance, at layoffs and CEO pay. And what we find is that the CEOs that lay off the most prodigiously tend to be the highest paid CEOs. We also find that CEOs that outsource to fit that category as well. So all the negative aspects of CEO behavior that you can think of end up linking to higher CEO compensation.
Okay, so we have this extraordinary delta between what your average worker makes and what a CEO makes. How much of wealth inequality is a function of that delta? In other words, like,
that's
good.
Great question. Great question. If you look at the top 1/10 of 1%, the richest 1/10 of 1% of folks in the United States, a huge proportion of those happen to be top corporate executives and top banking executives. In fact, they make up 60% of the top 1/10 of 1%. So if we're talking about corporate and financial industry executive pay, if we're talking about getting that under control, we're speaking to a real driver of income inequality in the United States.
What's the other 40%? I mean, I would imagine like there's some, I guess, inherited wealth there, and then.
Well, there's some inherited. You have, real estate tycoons like a certain Donald Trump. You have doctors. Some doctors have, built up empires. You have some attorneys. Interestingly, when people think of the super rich, they usually think of Oprah Winfrey and various LeBron James and other celebrities. But if you add up all the actors in Hollywood, all the sports stars, all of the recording artists, all these celebrities who were in the news, they only make up 3% of that top 1/10 of 1% in American society.
Wow. So this type of wealth is largely obscured to people, right?
Yes.
Like, I mean, we think we see it when we see Oprah or LeBron or your favorite podcaster or something, but we really don't see this at all, right? I mean, there's a handful of top executives that people know their names: Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos. But outside of like a small number of people, we don't see who these people are.
That's right. It's an invisible, so to speak, corporate elite that we have in the United States that has captured for itself a hugely disproportionate share of our nation's income and wealth.